They pushed. You didn't react. They went cold. You didn't chase the warmth back. They created distance. You let it exist. And for the first time in this dynamic, the silence wasn't theirs. It was yours. If this channel has been cutting through the noise for you, subscribe. This is where the real framework lives. Here is the reframe that restructures everything. You've been thinking about your reactions as natural, as the inevitable byproduct of being a person with emotions in a dynamic that regularly produces pain, confusion, and frustration. And that's true. Your reactions are human. They are valid. They are, in isolation, completely reasonable responses to unreasonable behavior. But here is what that framing misses entirely. Your reaction is not just a response. In this dynamic, your reaction is a resource that someone else has been consuming. Every time you reacted, with hurt, with frustration, with attempts to explain or resolve, you produced emotional data that the avoidance system used to regulate itself. Your pain confirmed their significance. Your pursuit confirmed their value. Your anxiety confirmed that the dynamic was still organized around them. None of this was conscious on their part. It doesn't need to be conscious to be structurally real. An avoidance behavioral pattern, the withdrawal, the inconsistency, the distance, is not random emotional expression. It is a regulation system. And that regulation system runs on a very specific fuel, your predictable emotional response. Remove the fuel and the system loses its operating mechanism. It doesn't gracefully adjust. It panics, because the one thing it was never built to handle is the absence of the input it depended on. This is the hidden mechanism most people never see. They think their silence is about withholding. It isn't. It's about removing the resource that made the pattern sustainable. And without that resource, the architecture of the avoidance behavioral system has nothing to stand on. Your silence doesn't break them because it's cruel. It breaks them because it's the first accurate reflection of what the dynamic actually was. And without your reaction to hide behind, they have to face that reflection directly. Here is how that breaking moves through distinct psychological phases. The first phase is the expectation architecture. Before your silence, a behavioral blueprint existed. They acted in a specific way, withdrew, went cold, created distance, and you responded in a specific way. The response was so consistent that it became structural, encoded. They didn't consciously expect your reaction. They simply operated within a dynamic where it was the reliable outcome of their behavior. This is the baseline. The architecture that your silence is about to dismantle. Externally, everything looks like a familiar pattern. Internally, for them, there is zero psychological expenditure around you. The outcome, your availability, your engagement, your emotional output is assumed. You are a settled variable. Until you aren't. The second phase is the signal disruption. The moment your silence replaces your reaction, the architecture registers an anomaly. The expected signal didn't arrive. They withdrew, and you didn't pursue. They went cold, and you didn't warm it back up. They created the distance, and you occupied it differently than before. Externally, you appear composed, present, but fundamentally unreachable in the way that used to be accessible. Internally, their pattern recognition system flags the discrepancy as significant. Something in the environment changed. The data doesn't match the expectation. And a nervous system built on environmental predictability treats unexpected breaks in pattern as priority-level information. They begin allocating cognitive resources toward figuring out what changed. You have become, involuntarily, from their side, the most interesting variable in the room. The third phase is the escalation loop. Before the panic fully surfaces, the system attempts to restore the familiar architecture through increased input. The behavior that reliably produced your reaction gets amplified. More distance, more coldness, more of whatever previously generated the strongest emotional response from you. This is not strategic cruelty. This is the system doing what all systems do when output fails to materialize: increase the input until the expected response returns. Externally, this looks like them doubling down on the very behavior that drove the original tension. Internally, they are running a correction protocol. The escalation is diagnostic. It tells you that your silence is registering deeply, because behavior that produces no response doesn't need to be escalated. The escalation is evidence that they feel the absence of your reaction acutely enough to try to provoke its return. The fourth phase is the internal collapse. If you hold the silence through the escalation, if the increased provocation still produces no emotional reaction from you, the system hits a structural failure point. There is no more input to increase. The architecture has been tested at maximum capacity, and the expected output still isn't arriving. This is the collapse. Not visible, not dramatic, quiet, internal. A disorienting recognition that the dynamic they were operating in has fundamentally changed in a way they cannot reverse through the tools they've always used. Externally, the behavior shifts. The escalation stops. You may see a sudden change in tone, an unexpected softness, an unusual vulnerability, a reaching out that feels qualitatively different from the indirect contact of the escalation phase. Internally, what they're experiencing is the loss of the one thing their pattern depended on: your predictability. And without your predictability, they are confronting something genuinely unfamiliar. The possibility that they have lost something they cannot easily restore. The fifth phase is the gravity reversal. This is where the dynamic's fundamental architecture has been rewritten. Before your silence, you were organized around them, their moods, their distance, their signals. After the silence, they are organized around you, your stillness, your unreadability, your presence that no longer functions as an automatic resource. The gravity of the dynamic has reversed, not because you played a game, because you stopped participating in a system that required your reactivity to function. In this phase, the avoidance internal experience of you is no longer comfortable or familiar. It is charged, uncertain, genuinely engaging in a way that comfort never was. This is where sustained attention, not manufactured, but structurally real, becomes possible for the first time. Here is the contrast that separates the people who shift dynamics from the people who stay trapped in them. Most people, when they feel the pull to react, when the avoidance behavior produces the familiar surge of hurt, frustration, or anxiety, respond from that emotional state immediately. The reaction is automatic. And because it's automatic, it confirms to the avoidance system that the architecture is intact, that the pattern can continue operating unchanged. Each reaction, however justified, resets the baseline, tells the system the output is still available. Keep running. What actually dismantles the pattern is not a better reaction, not a more articulate confrontation, not a more patient explanation. It is the decision made in advance from a place of genuine clarity, to stop making your emotional state automatically available to someone whose behavior has consistently demonstrated that they will consume it without accountability. This decision is not emotional suppression. It is emotional sovereignty. You feel everything you feel. You simply stop externalizing it in ways that feed a system built on your reactivity. The people who successfully shift this dynamic are not the ones who became cold. They are the ones who became self-contained. And self-containment, in a dynamic built on your emotional transparency, is the most disruptive force you can introduce. 5 principles for executing your silence with structural precision. The first is grounded stillness. Silence without internal grounding becomes suppression, and suppression is neither sustainable nor genuinely powerful. Before the silence can work externally, it has to be real internally. That means processing your emotional state privately, thoroughly, and in spaces that belong to you. Not in the dynamic, not in the interaction, not as a visible performance of being unaffected. Real stillness comes from genuine processing, not from pretending you feel nothing. The second is behavioral consistency. The silence must be consistent to be structurally effective. Intermittent non-reaction teaches the system that the reaction is still available, just delayed. Consistent non-reaction teaches the system that the architecture has changed. Every time you hold the stillness when the provocation arrives, you are reinforcing a new structural reality. Every time you break it prematurely, you reset the entire baseline. Consistency here is not stubbornness. It is the actual mechanism of change. The third is parallel construction. The energy that would have gone into reacting, processing the dynamic publicly, or managing the emotional fallout of their behavior needs to be redirected with intention. Build something in that space, your craft, your physical capacity, your relationships, your intellectual development. The parallel construction serves 2 functions. It gives the displaced energy somewhere genuine to go. And it means your silence is backed by a life that is actually expanding, which is qualitatively different from silence that is simply waiting. One communicates absence. The other communicates fullness. The fourth is calibrated response. When interaction does occur, your response must communicate ease rather than effort, not coldness, ease. The difference is precise. Coldness communicates that you're working to suppress something. Ease communicates that you're simply operating from a different level. A brief, warm, unhurried response does more psychological work than either enthusiastic engagement or visible withdrawal. It signals that the dynamic is no longer the primary organizing force in your internal world. The fifth is non-attachment to their process. Your silence is not a tool you're using to produce a specific outcome in them. The moment it becomes that, it stops being silence and starts being strategy. And strategy leaks through behavior in ways that undermine its own effectiveness. Your silence is the natural result of deciding that your emotional energy has a standard. What they do with the absence of your reaction is their process. Observe it without ownership. The most powerful position is the one where you are equally prepared for them to grow toward you, or to reveal that they won't, and at peace with either outcome. Here is where the tactical becomes something deeper. Every principle above is useful, but the transformation available in this work is not about managing an avoidance internal experience. It is about permanently restructuring your relationship to your own emotional output. You don't react. You assess. You don't pursue stillness as a strategy. You pursue it as an accurate reflection of your own value. You don't perform being unaffected. You build a life substantial enough that the performance is no longer required. You don't withhold your reaction to create power. You withhold it because you've decided your emotional world is not a resource that gets consumed without consent. You don't measure the success of your silence by whether it broke them. You measure it by who you became while holding it. This is the version of you that the silence is building if you let it complete its work. Not harder, not colder, not more guarded, more self-possessed, more internal, more genuinely difficult to take for granted. Here is the perspective that ties everything together. At its deepest level, the reason your silence breaks an avoidant is not because it creates suffering in them. It is because it removes the mirror they were using to avoid themselves. Your reaction, your hurt, your pursuit, your emotional availability was giving them something to look at that wasn't their own interior. The moment you go quiet, the mirror goes dark. And what they are left facing is not you. It is themselves, their own patterns, their own choices, their own architecture without your response to hide behind. That confrontation with themselves in the silence you created is the most honest thing that dynamic has ever produced. Your silence is not punishment. It is clarity. It is the refusal to keep making yourself a buffer between someone and the natural consequences of their own behavior. And the version of you that can hold that silence, not with anger, not with grief, but with genuine, grounded self-possession, is not the version that entered this dynamic. That version is someone new. Someone who doesn't need the avoidant to panic, to change, or to recognize what they had in order to know their own worth. That version already knows. The question is simply this: are you ready to become them?